Chapter 19, Working Capital Management. And this chapter is about how do we manage essentially cash. As you know from definition of working capital is, or what we call net working capital. Net working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. Current assets is generally cash plus accounts receivable plus inventory. And current liabilities is accounts payable and sometimes maybe notes payable. So current assets reflect things that are cash or cash type, that are almost equivalent to cash, that the firm has on hand. And current liabilities refer to all of the things that are cash type that the firm is obligated to pay out in 1 year or less. So the difference between current asset and current liabilities is essentially the float, or essentially the cash that the firm has on hand that will allow them to plan for any contingencies. And there is cash for a firm is a dual-edged sword. On one hand, cash gives the firm liquidity. So if they see some opportunity to invest something, or if there are unforeseen circumstances where they have to cover for some liability, the cash on hand gives them the cushion, the liquidity, the flexibility to meet those unforeseen contingencies. And that's good, because that means the firm has enough float that it can, enough cash on hand that it can use that to meet those contingencies, meaning if they did not have the cash on hand and they incurred a liability or they saw a new opportunity, then to make that investment or to cover that liability, they would have to sell certain assets to make good on those opportunities. But having cash on hand prevents them from even thinking about selling assets to cover for those opportunities. So that's the good news about cash on hand, liquidity. The bad news is that cash is unproductive. Cash is like money sitting inside your drawer. The good thing is that you have it. The bad news is that you are not using it to make more money. In other words, you are not investing that money. So some amounts of cash on hand is good, but excessive amounts of cash on hand is actually an opportunity cost, because it represents an opportunity lost for the firm to make good on some investments and make a return on some investments. So a good working capital management policy requires careful calibration that these items, cash, accounts receivable, inventory, accounts payable, these 4 items are the main ones, that we are managing these 4 items in such a manner that we have enough cash to meet our liquidity needs, but not too much cash that we are giving up on productive investment opportunities. So again, as I mentioned, these are the main items that we are going to be, these are the main components of our working capital, and we have to manage them in a way that gives us enough liquidity without losing too many opportunities for investment. So when we think about the cash cycle, and often businesses like to think about these in terms of cash cycle. So the cash cycle is the length of time between when the firm pays cash to purchase its initial inventory and then when it receives cash from the sale of the output produced from that inventory. So when you think about this item over here, inventory, why do firms invest in inventory? Inventory is items that they have purchased that they're going to use to produce a good that they are going to then sell to make some money. So If inventory is sitting there for too long, then that's unproductive. And if you do not have enough inventory, then you can suffer from what we call stockouts, that you do not have enough raw material on hand to produce the goods that you need to produce. So a good cash cycle, so the firm will have to manage the cash cycle in a way that the length of time between when the firm is paying the money to purchase the inventory and then receiving cash or receiving receivables when they sell that finished product to their customers, that cash cycle is as minimal as possible. So within the cash cycle, there is the operating cycle. That's the average length of time when a firm originally purchases its inventory and then when it receives cash back from selling its product. Okay, so that's the cash cycle, and the way we calculate cash cycle is we take the number of days inventory is sitting before we are selling inventory, selling that product, the number of days it takes for us to collect on accounts receivable, because when a company makes a sale, it takes a little bit time before the money from that sale is collected as cash. That's what we call the terms of trade. The company will extend a grace period. This is particularly for B2B selling, business to business transaction. They will offer them a grace period before which they have to pay up on whatever they have purchased. And similarly, the grace period extends on the other direction when the company has to make good on the goods or services that they have procured. So it's the net of these. How many days it takes to sell inventory, how many days does it take to pay, how many days does it take to collect accounts receivable, and how many days does it take to pay accounts payable. The net of that is the cash conversion cycle. So with the way we calculate inventory days, this is recap from our financial ratios chapter. We take inventory, this is coming from the balance sheet, and then we divide that by average daily cost of goods sold, which is cost of goods sold divided by 365, the number of days in a year. Similarly, accounts receivable days, if we take accounts receivable and divide that by average daily sales, which would be sales divided by 365. And then accounts payable, same thing, accounts payable divided by average daily cost of goods sold, which is back to this formula over here. So that's how we are calculating inventory. So inventory days represents how long does it take for the firm to convert its inventory into sales. Accounts receivable days indicate how long does it take for the firm to collect on sales that they have made. And accounts payable indicates how long does it take for the firm to pay out the money that they owe to their vendors. So typically, what we would like to see for a firm is these inventory days and accounts receivable days are as short as possible, and the account payable days are as long as possible. That will give us the shortest amount of time for cash conversion. We would like it to be as short as possible. So here is a typical timeline that most businesses will engage in. The firm will buy inventory, then the firm will take a few days before it pays for it. Then it takes a few more days to produce the product, to sell the product, and then it receives payment from customers that bought the product. So the period between when the firm places the order to the point where they pay for the inventory, that's our accounts payable time period. The time between when the firm places the order for the inventory and they sell the inventory, produce the product and sell the product, that's our days in inventory. And the time between when they sell the product and when they receive the payment from that sale is accounts receivable. So what are we doing? We are adding these two numbers up, we are adding these two numbers up, and we are subtracting, sorry, we are adding these two numbers up. Let me clear everything. We are adding these two, inventory and accounts receivable, and then from that we are subtracting accounts payable. So that the remainder that we have, over here represents our cash cycle. And the whole thing from here all the way to here represents our operating cycle. So two different cycles, cash cycle versus operating cycle. What we are mostly interested in is the cash cycle. So this is from Dell's 2012 income statement. And balance sheet. What do we have? We have sales, cost of goods sold, they're coming from the income statement. And then we have these three items that are coming from the balance sheet: accounts receivable, inventory, and accounts payable. So how do we calculate Dell's cash conversion cycle? The first thing we do is we calculate inventory days. Take inventory, divide that by the cost of goods sold, which is this number over here, cost of goods sold, divided that by 365. That gives us 11.27. Accounts receivable, we take accounts receivable, divide that by daily sales. Sales number again coming from here. And then we are dividing that by 365. So that's 63 days to collect our accounts receivable. And then to pay our accounts payable, 124 days. So Dell's cash conversion cycle is it takes 11 days to produce the inventory, 63 days to collect on the receivable, but they delay their payment by 124 days, giving it a negative 49.80 as your cash conversion cycle. So Dell has a negative cash conversion cycle. What does it mean? It generally receives cash for its computers before it pays its suppliers. That's the implication of a negative cash conversion cycle. Similarly, you can work on a problem like this. And a similar problem. Just you can review them very quickly from your PowerPoint slides. So here is the cash conversion cycle for different companies. You can see over here, these three companies have a negative cash conversion cycle. That means they receive cash before they pay out their cash. And then you have companies over here, they have very large, they take 300 and almost a year, a little bit more than a year to fully, for their cash conversion cycle to play out. Because that means they take, as you can see, the inventory sits for a long period of time, which makes sense because they are residential construction. It takes a while to build a house. So while they pay and it takes only 12 days for them to receive their accounts receivable, and they're pretty prompt in paying their vendors, but this is what drives up their cash conversion cycle. Similarly over here, what drives these negatives is that these three companies take a long time to pay their vendors. And because of the size of these companies, their vendors allow them to kind of get away with it. So what is the impact of working capital on firm value? So working capital, again, to recap, net working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. So the change in net working capital, meaning the working capital change from one year to the next year, will be, so delta over here is a sign that indicates change. Delta of current asset, the change in current assets, minus delta, meaning the change in current liabilities. So when the change in net working capital is positive, meaning net working capital has increased from 1 year to the next year. So next year's net working capital compared to this year's net working capital represents an increase. What does that mean? It means that the change in current asset is greater than the change in current liabilities. That means current assets increased faster than current liabilities. And if you think about our formula for cash conversion cycle, if you look at the formula for cash conversion cycle, what do we like to see? We like to see the liability side, the payable side, to be as high as possible, and the asset side to be as short as possible. That will allow us to shorten the cash cycle. But over here, what's happening? When net working capital is positive, it is the current asset side that is longer than the current liability side. So the net impact of an increase in net working capital is that it will reduce free cash flow. And vice versa. If net working capital is reduced, so delta net working capital is a negative, that means next year's working capital reduced compared to this year's, went down compared to this year's net working capital. This would imply that the change in current asset is less than the change in current liability. Thus, this would imply increase in cash flow. So reduction in net working capital generates positive free cash flow. So anytime net working capital goes down, free cash flow goes up, firm value goes up. So the relationship between net working capital and firm value is inverse. When net working capital goes up, value goes down because cash flow goes down. And net working capital goes down, firm value goes up. That's what we mean by an inverse relationship between firm value and net working capital. So here are the projected net income and free cash flow for this company. We have net income. To that we add back depreciation. We subtract capital expenditures. And since it's an increase in net working capital, I subtract that number. That gives me my free cash flow. So free cash flow formula is net income plus depreciation minus capital expenditure minus changes in net working capital. When the change in net working capital is positive, its impact is a negative cash flow. That's what we see here. So increases in net working capital is a negative cash flow. So that gives us free cash flow of 19,000. So increases in net working capital, if they grow at 4% per year, and the company's cost of capital is 12%, and it wants to reduce its N by 20%, working capital by 20%, what will be the impact of this on Citi's value? What will, in other words, if it is more effective in managing its working capital, how will that impact the value of the firm? So a 20% decrease in working capital would reduce the starting point from 1 million per year to 800,000 per year. The working capital increases will still grow at 4% per year, but each year the increase would then be 20% smaller because of the 20% smaller starting point. So we can then value the impact of all of this change by using the present value of a growing annuity, which is cash flow, next year divided by R minus G. And cash flow is determined by net income plus depreciation minus capital expenditure minus increases in net working capital. So currently, it's 20 million plus 5 million, so net income plus depreciation minus capital expenditure minus increases in net working capital divided by R minus G gives us $237.5 million value. If they're more efficient in managing their net working capital, this remains the same, this remains the same, this remains the same. The change is over here. R minus G remain the same, so thus the value of the firm goes up. So a reduction in net working capital increases the value of the firm. Similarly, you can work on a problem like this, similar problems. The next thing we want to look at is trade credit. Trade credit is the difference between receivables and payables, that is the net amount of a firm's capital consumed as a result of those credit transactions. The credit, it's essentially the credit that the firm extends to its customers. So example over here is 210 net 30. This implies a cash discount. In this example, this is a 2% cash discount. You can take this 2% cash discount if you pay up on your receivables during the discount period. In this case, the discount period is 10 days because it says 210. The credit period, the total length of time that you have to pay up on this thing is 30 days. That's net 30. So 210 net 30, meaning a 2% discount if you pay up in 10 days or less. And then if you don't pay up in 10 days or less, you have another additional 20 days, meaning a total of 30 days to pay up whatever you owe. So here is, that means if you purchase something for $100 and you pay it up within the first 10 days, you can get away with paying $98. That's the 2% discount. But if you pay any time after these 10 days, over the next 20 days, you still have to pay up the full amount of 100. So trade credits are essentially a good way to speed up collection of accounts receivable. Firms allow these trade credit as an incentive. This $2 incentive over here, this 2% incentive over here is to incentivize the speedy collection of receivables. What's the cost of trade credit? Of course, the actual cost that we get is determined by the equivalent annual rate or the effective annual rate, which, as we have learned earlier, is 1 plus the nominal rate raised to the power n minus 1, where n is the time period. So over here, if we have 115, that means a 1% credit for 15 days, and the net has to be paid within 40 days, what's the effective annual cost for this? This is 1% over 15 days. What is this in annual terms? That's essentially the question over here. So if you pay within 15 days, this 1% of 100 means a $1 discount. That means you are paying $99 in 15 days or $100 in 40 days. So the difference between the $99 payment and the $100 payment is 25 days. So you need to compute the interest rate over these 25 days and then compute the EAR, essentially annualize that over the 25 days. That's the task over here. So you have a $1 discount on a $99 payment. That means your interest rate over the 25 days is 1.1%. So there are 365 divided by 25, that means there are 14.6 25-day period in a year. So the whole thing is, this is a 25-day period, but if I repeat this, if I think of this and the end time being 1 year, I would have to repeat this 25-day period 14.6 times to get to 1 year. So thus your effective interest rate would be 1.0101 raised to the power 14.6 minus 1, or 15.8. Another way you could do this is to use the iConvert. You could use the iConvert feature in your calculator. And you would enter nominal as 1.01, CY, the number of compounding periods, as 14.6, and you can calculate effective. So effective interest rate would be 15.8%. Similarly, you can practice some of these other questions over here. So why do companies offer trade credit? It says simple and it is simple and convenient to use, and it lowers transaction cost. It's flexible source of funds that can be used elsewhere, so that it's 1%, but that 1% over that 15-day period represented essentially an effective return of 15%. So if you can manage these trade credits properly, you are effectively generating return for your company. And thus you are freeing up funds that could be used elsewhere. Firms offer trade credit because it's an indirect form of financing. It's an indirect way to lower prices for customers who are prompt in their payment. And it also creates the opportunities for business relationship. A long-term business relationship with customers helps businesses curry favor with customers, which means they can then keep them in the fold for a longer period of time. The last thing we want to look at is float. Float is essentially the time it takes to what we're looking at is the collection float. So the collection float is the time it takes for a fund, for a firm to collect on the funds that it is owed from the customer for the sale of its goods and services. So between the time that the customer is mailing the check and the time the funds is actually credited to the account, there is a time delay. What is the cause of this delay? There's a delay in mailing something, that is, the check is coming in the mail. There is a delay in processing, and then there's a delay in availability of that money for whatever banking reasons. So that's your collection float. And then you have disbursement float. It is the time it takes before payments to suppliers actually result in a cash outflow. Firms can employ several methods to reduce their collection and disbursement of floats. They can use electronic check processing. that can significantly delay. Of course, you can take away the mailing aspect of it, and also sometimes the quicker availability of that fund. So the float you may think about is as trivial, but that lag between the time the check is actually cut and the funds are available, if you think about that lag being repeated many, many times over large sums of money, then that can also result in a challenge and a problem for the firm if it does not have those funds quickly available. So it is in their interest to set up policies and set up methods by which those things are expedited. So when a firm sets its credit policy, it's a policy that the firm has to set. There's no laws that govern it. It's simply adopting best practices in the business world. They have to establish who they extend these credit terms to. They have to establish the credit terms itself, the discount amount, the length of period over which that discount will be provided, and the total amount of time that they will give before the payment is fully due, establishing the entire terms of that credit policy. So that's all part of receivables management. If the firm is doing this thing properly, they will be able to hopefully speed up the process of collecting on their receivables. And yet the firm may not want to push their customers too much, because if they push their customers too much, do not offer them enough credit terms, then the customer may go elsewhere, go to the competition for their services, goods or services. So the 5 C's that are used to determine credit policy: character of the company, capacity, capital, what kind of collateral do they have, and what are the market conditions that prevail during that time period. You can read through this on your own and just review these. These are just word problems that you can read through and figure out how credit policy may be established to speed up the process to collect on their funds. And ultimately what we are looking for is the impact the current policy has on net present value and the impact the new policy will have on net present value. So if the net present value from the switch is positive, then we will enact the switch in policy. If it is not positive, then we will not enact the switch in policy. So what we're looking at is cash flows under the current policy versus cash flows under the alternative policy. So that's what we're looking at. And to set up the cash flows, we are looking at how much does it cost to produce the unit, how much are they paying for the unit, what happens. So these are customers who are paying a reduced price. These are customers who are paying a discounted price, and so on and so forth. So this gives us our cash flows now versus our cash flows 30 days from now because of the terms to this. So these are customers who are taking advantage of the terms to trade, and these are customers who are not taking advantage of the terms to trade. So these two are not taking advantage of it. This is, of course, the cost to produce the good. So those are our net cash flows. So I take that, I take all of that, and I put that into my NPV equation. So this is my upfront net cash flow. So this is C0, this is C01, this is IY, and I'm computing net present value. Then I look at the new policy, the alternative policy. This is how much it is costing me to produce the good. This is how much customers are giving me, and this is the production for the next 1,000 units. So my net cash flow in time 0 is this much. 30 days from today, my cash flow is this much. So now this is my C0. This whole thing over here is my C01. This one is my IY, and this is my new net present value. So over here, it would make sense to switch. it will make sense to switch the policy. Pretty straightforward and kind of repetition of the concepts and ideas that we have gone over before. Accounts receivable, we are trying to monitor the accounts receivable days. It's the average number of days it takes the firm to collect on its sales. And there is an aging schedule where accounts are categorized by the number of days they have been on the firm's books, meaning how long does it take to collect $1,000 from the first customer, $1,000 from the next customer, and so on and so forth. How long is it taking for the company to collect on its different accounts? So it's possible that you could have a company with about 220 accounts that are being collected in 15 days, but they also have 20 accounts that are taking 60 days to collect. Another way of putting this is it takes about 15 days to collect on $530,000, but it takes upwards of 60 days to collect on about $70,000. So this is the total amount that is outstanding, but not all of it is outstanding over the same time period. Of course, we want to have more over here and less over here. That would be the goal of managing our accounts receivable. Similarly, payable, the firm should monitor their accounts payable because they want to be, on one hand, they want to delay the accounts payable as much as possible, but they also do not want to delay it so much that they spoil their credit ratings in the market or they spoil their reputation in the market. So they can figure out what their accounts payable schedules are in that manner and manage it in that manner. Again, you can read through these problems very quickly. And one of the ways in which accounts payable can be stretched out, when a firm ignores a due date payment and pays later, then what it does is that if you stretch it out too much, then you may not receive the terms of credit, you will receive what is called a COD, a cash on delivery, which means you have to make your accounts payable effectively zero. Or sometimes it could be negative, cash before delivery. Your reputation is so poor in the market, your credit ratings are so poor in the market that nobody will trust you with any product until you pay them cash upfront or sometimes even before a delivery period. Okay. Finally, inventory management. There is a cost to holding inventory. First of all, there's a benefit to holding inventory because it minimizes the risk that the firm will not be able to obtain its input that they need to produce the product. In other words, holding inventory avoids stockouts. That's the term we use. The stockout is essentially running out of stock to produce the product. So that's the benefit of holding inventory. But there's a cost. There's a cost of acquisition. You have to pay that money up front. That means money leaves your bank account. It is not earning an interest. There is a cost to order, transaction cost, brokerage cost, whatever. And finally, there's something called the carrying cost. When inventory sits in silos or on your factory floor or in your storage areas, there are several things that can happen. Number one, you would need insurance to cover any damage that may happen to that inventory. Number two, there may be spoilage. Just by natural attrition, things may fall apart. Some things will be lost. There could be spoilage through theft, for example, or spoilage through misuse of that inventory. All of that is covered under what we call the cost of carry or the carrying cost. So the benefits of avoiding stockouts has to be evaluated against these additional costs that the firm bears whenever it is holding inventory. So one of the ways in which the firm can avoid that problem is to practice what is called just-in-time inventory management, where essentially the inventory balance is effectively zero. Inventory raw material comes in and product leaves almost simultaneously. So if a company is very good at managing this, they can reduce inventory management to zero. I already talked about the motivation to holding cash. Essentially, it provides for liquidity, for contingencies, for any compensating balance for the bank, transaction balance to meet day-to-day needs. But then you're also losing out on alternative opportunities to invest. And again, you have to balance between the benefits of liquidity. These are essentially against the loss of return because you did not invest that excess cash. And that pretty much completes chapter 19, working capital management.